having me here today. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. Good morning. I'm excited. It's Saturday. That was a great and comprehensive explanation about the triple play and how we got here. You know, I'm often reminded of that Chinese proverb, which I actually think may have been a curse. Someone in the audience may know about, may you live in interesting times. Boy, are we. And it's really discouraging to see at the national level the breakdown of common human decency. And more to the point, the breakdown of some of our core foundations of our democracy. I mean, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but when we have a presidential candidate at a debate say that he's going to jail his opponent if he wins, or already calling into question the outcome of the election because he refuses to accept the fact that he's the worst candidate that's ever been put up by a major party since they've been elected. It's a problem, and it's a problem for us because there's a lot of people that believe that message. And so what we have seen here in this state is, this governor has the dubious distinction of being the least popular governor in the country. And that includes one that's accused of having policies that poison an entire town, and one that's in the process of being impeached. The problem is he's doing so much damage on his way out the door that it's going to take us decades to recover from. He first started by attacking the courts in his State of the State speech in 2013. That was the earliest reference that we saw that he had made to this, where he had called for their direct elections or changing the way we select the Supreme Court justices. Right before that, they defunded a very important group. It was the Judicial Review Council that would issue surveys, peer-reviewed surveys that would go out and they would ask attorneys, other judges to review, it was all anonymous, to review the performance of their colleagues on the bench. This group would compile that and publish those findings. It's really important. That was a check and balance in the system, a way to highlight what was actually happening. So they defunded that. And so they've tried to get rid of the data. By the way, this is the exact same process at the federal level that they did. It was actually referred to as the T-Hart Amendment from the former congressman from Wichita as it relates to gun violence. They made it so that the federal agencies could not keep track of gun violence. So this is the pattern, right? Let's destroy the data and prevent it from happening. Thankfully, you get a friend Bennett in the audience, wave your hand, from Kansas Appleseed. Got together with a group of other nonprofit organizations and brought back the Judicial Review Survey. This is the second time that they've done that, and it's up now at Judge Review.
KansasJudgeReview.org.
Thank you. So if you all want to see these rankings, go there. So that's the data piece, right? So that's, the next comes the smear campaign, which is what Brownback started in 2013. So since he first attacked the courts publicly, there have been over 55 bills that have been introduced to attack these courts, penalize them, curtail their power, or go after their funding. And there's a handout that has been passed around that outlines these attacks and gives you the bill numbers if you want to look any of them up. But in the course of that, they actually passed the bill. It started out as a way to curtail the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court's power to select district court chief judges. and I won't bore you with all the details. I'm going to hit some complicated things and gloss over them very quickly, which will do a disservice to them, but in the sake of time and not getting bogged down into the details, I'll hit that. I'm happy to explain afterwards any of those specifics. So once this passed, it was clearly unconstitutional on its face. So the legislature passed a companion bill that said if the court struck it down, their entire judicial budget would be eliminated. So not surprising, this case was brought by Judge Solomon, who is a chief judge of a district court with the Brennan Center. The court ruled this unconstitutional. And that provision kicked in that defunded, zeroed out the entire judicial branch budget. Now, our attorneys working with the Attorney General put an emergency stay to keep the courts funded. But I want you to hear what I just said. This legislature and the governor signed it into law, a bill that defunded an entire branch of government because they disagreed with them on the way they ruled in the school finance case. Never before in the history of our country that we've been able to find have two branches of government teamed up to actively defund the third branch. Now, what's the ramifications of that? When Kansas was founded, they wanted a courthouse within a day's horse ride of every citizen. So we've got 105 counties, 105 courthouses, plus some other ones that are mixed in there. This would have zeroed out and made it impossible for those courthouses to open. If you needed a protection order, you couldn't have gotten one. If you needed a divorce, you couldn't have gotten one. If you needed to finalize an adoption, it wouldn't have happened. And these folks that claim to be so hard on law and order and crime and punishment, had anyone been arrested for a crime in that time that the courts were shut down, their federal constitutionally protected rights to due process and speedy trial would have been violated, throwing their convictions in doubt. These aren't hypotheticals. This is what's happened. I've been doing this work now for longer than I care to admit, probably over 15 years. This is perhaps the most important thing that I've ever been involved in. We are at a tipping point in our state. This governor is trying to get power over this court. And the reason is pretty simple. Kansans for Life issued letters to lawmakers in the middle of this session saying that this was the single most important issue that they had, and that if their lawmakers did not support the elimination of the merit process, that they could not receive their support. There is an abortion case working its way through. Kansas was supposed to be one of the test states for the anti-choice movement to get an eventual outright challenge to Roe. This is the case that they were referencing. So that's the social component to this, right? So the practical component to this is, as you all know, these tax elimination that has been passed, we can't afford, and it's bankrupting our state. K-12 funding is the single biggest expenditure that we make out of the general fund. You cannot have that and a complete dropping out of the floor of our revenue happen at the same time. They don't work. So we don't know how the court will ultimately rule on this bigger piece of adequacy, which is before them now. But we've seen how they've come out on the other issues. Every single time, They've stood up for our kids. They're the only ones in Topeka now. This is changing, and the phone banking and everything else will help this, to help change that narrative in the legislature. But right now, they're the only ones standing up for our kids in the Constitution. Everything is on the line. If we gut the rest of our school system, we run the very real risk of locking in generational poverty into this state because of our geographic challenges that we will not be able to overcome. That is the Brownback legacy. And if he's able to knock out 5 of the 7 Supreme Court justices and replace them, we're going to be dealing with this legacy for decades in a very real way. So we got together with our coalition partners and said, we've got to stop this. How do we do it? So we organized, meeting with folks like you and helping to spread the message. Because the truth is, Kansans are on our side. Poll after poll tells us that Kansans view our court system as the most trusted branch of government, the most trusted institution that we have. And this is also important because, just anecdotally, we know that any group, all of us at some time will need the court system. And it's not always fun. If you're dealing with the courts, you're usually in trouble. Being sued, suing, there's a criminal issue. It's not always the case, it's not always bad, but at some point, we will call on them. We know that women, in the course of their life, disproportionately will use a court at some point. We saw a court recently stand up for Kansas voters that this Secretary of State, which has the gall to claim he's trying to stop voter fraud while simultaneously blocking tens of thousands of Kansans from voting, and then prosecuting elderly Kansans that made a mistake when they cast their ballot. This is what we're at. And it's not surprising that this governor, who has made his political life based around so-called family values, endorsed this presidential candidate, and then have the gall this week, a few days ago, to double down on his endorsement, and saying that even after everything that's come out, even after all of the proof that's happened, the disrespect of women, the disrespect of those with special needs, all of these issues, he's still on board with this man because, in his words, all that matters is the U.S. Supreme Court. Folks, this is a window into this governor's mind. If you don't think he's not fully and completely in control of the effort to oust these justices, you're wrong. We know there is a group, Kansans for Justice, that's made up of victims' families from the horrible murders that occurred in Wichita. We now know that his campaign team is actively working on that group's behalf. We have heard that there is out-of-state money that's being poured into this race to try and go after these justices. But we all know the real motive behind this, and it's a pure power grab. The good news is Kansans are behind us, and Kansans see through this. But we've got to get those folks out to the voting box. And when they're there, we've got to get them to complete their ballot. Some of the most important races are at the bottom of the ballot, which would be the Kansas Supreme Court, the Kansas Court of Appeals. And we're encouraging folks, it's a very simple message, vote yes 5 times. Vote yes to retain all of the justices. Now I know that one of the justices, Justice Stegall, was Brownback's former chief counsel, may not be the most popular individual in this room. But let me tell you, he came through the merit selection system to be put onto the Supreme Court. And that's what's the most important. He had that peer review process. He was submitted to the governor. The governor appointed him, and since he's been on the bench, he's made rulings that line up with the rest of the justices. So I encourage you, even if you may have misgivings about 1 or 2 of the justices individually, to put those aside and look at the totality of the system. We have this merit-based process that was put in place after a political scandal. It is the gold standard for selecting justices and judges to the courts across the country. The majority of states have some version of this plan, also sometimes known as the Missouri Plan, in place for selecting judges and justices to fill vacancies on the court. We expect that we're going to be outspent in this campaign, but that's okay. We don't need to have the most money, we need to have enough money. And more important, we need to have folks like you that are active and committed and working. You are opinion leaders with your circles of friends and your colleagues. And as we get closer to the election, they're going to ask you about this stuff. And I encourage you strongly to repeat, vote yes 5 times for the justices. One of the other handouts, there were 2 handouts that were passed around. One goes through the attacks that are being lobbied at the courts. The other one, frankly, just explains the merit system in a little bit more succinct detail, because it's just a one-page flyer. But I just want to say a couple quick things, because I think you all have heard some of this misinformation that's being out there. Let it never be said that this administration lets facts get in the way of a good spin story. I mean, he even now wants to change up how the economists make formulations of the budget. The system's worked for every other administration for decades, yet somehow now we've run into problems. But at the end of the day, you can't change addition and subtraction. Those rules are universal. But one of the biggest things that this governor has said, and that you often hear, is that this is the most overturned court in the country. These are activist judges. That could not be further from the truth. Since Chief Justice Lawton Nuss took over as Chief Justice in August of 2010, they've issued, and the number is on the sheet, I think it's 3,600 opinions, or 1,300 opinions. And in the course of that, the U.S. Supreme Court has only overturned 5 cases, less than 0.5%. This is the dance part of the presentation. So think about that. 1,300 cases, and they've overturned less than 0.5%. Now, it's true that some of those cases had to deal with the death penalty. But you know, part of this process, and this doesn't fit in an easy 30-second soundbite, is anytime that a state brings back a death penalty, especially a state like ours that wrote the law very narrowly and incompletely, There are a series of challenges that happen. It's part of the judicial review process. That is exactly what those cases were that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. So once we worked out, for a better way of saying it, the flaws in the death penalty bill, which is what happens in that judicial review process, what's come back now is essentially, whether you agree with it or not, that's not what I'm speaking to right now, but what's come back now is that we have now worked out those issues with the death penalty in Kansas. And so we've seen since that has happened, since those outstanding issues have been settled with the law, we've seen that the Supreme Court has upheld death penalty convictions. The Robinson case, a horrific case in the Kansas City area, where he put the victims' bodies in barrels. And in the Cheevers case, which was a young man that shot and killed a sheriff down in Greenwood County, I believe. And that case is a perfect example of, initially the Supreme Court had struck down the death penalty on a technicality. It went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court said, no, that issue's fine. Sent it back to the Kansas Supreme Court, and they upheld it. Folks, that's exactly how this process works, or should work, especially when we're applying the ultimate sentence. So that's that misnomer. There are a lot of others that are floating out there. We've put the 4 biggest ones on that case. But on the judicial activism issue, I'll just say, and I brought up the website from Bennett, that's kansasjudgereview.org, because these are their peers. This is an anonymous survey, and you'll see overwhelmingly that their peers say there's no such thing. So as we move forward, let's not get confused by the rhetoric that's out there. We know what this is about. This is about Governor Brownback and his political cronies, like Kansans for Life, that are working because they absolutely want verdicts in cases that are important to them to be ruled, not based on the Constitution, not based on the rule of law, but will be the most politically expedient for their own political agendas. We cannot allow this to happen. We are better people, we are better state, and we will survive this government. But it's going to take you all making the phone calls, knocking on the doors, and helping to spread this message.